until we do have a quorum, which would move us on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Transportation Equity Framework. And I believe Jonathan Slayson is going to speak to that.
Yeah, I'll turn it over to Dave Pelletier here first from VTrans. He's the project manager, and I think he can give you a bit of an overview.
Nicely done.
Thanks for having us. It's good to see some familiar faces. I'll keep my comments just really brief and introduce Jonathan just in the name of time and saving as much of it for discussion as possible. But suffice to say, and you'll see Jonathan repeat this in the presentation quickly. We were directed by the legislature. The Agency of Transportation was directed to work with the regional planning commissions, not this most recent session, but at the end of the 2021 session, to turn the mirror on ourselves and look at the work that we do and the programs that we run and the projects that we develop and all of the process from the planning all the way to project implementation and monitoring, and really look at all of those steps and stages through an equity lens. And Jonathan will get into some definitions and what that means. We took the route of contracting with Jonathan and a really skilled, diverse team of consultant assistants with a couple different sub consultants that have particular expertise. And we're going around the state and kind of presenting the work and having a discussion with all the RPCs as one aspect of the public outreach. And Jonathan will put that in context as well. But I'll leave it at that. John's got really all the nitty gritty, and we'll get into some question and answer afterwards as well. So yeah, thanks for having us.
Great, thanks, Dave. So we'll get going into this. I think for context, we have about probably 15-20 minutes of probably some material that I want to share with you, and then we'll have definitely a back and forth. And I realize your agenda is pretty packed tonight with some pretty substantive topics, so I'll be sensitive to that as well. But I also want you to feel free to interrupt me if there's something that really jumps out at you and would like to have a conversation of further. But if it's detours us too far, I'll bring us back on track. So we're in a situation here with hybrid meetings. First off, I haven't introduced myself, but Jonathan Slayson, he, him pronouns, the project manager for the consultant team from RSG. And as Dave said, we have several sub-consultants that aren't on this call today, but they are playing a role in the various subtasks that we have as part of the project that I'll give you a summary in a subsequent slide. But in a hybrid meeting, we want to make sure that we make introductions clear. We would appreciate the video on. I know that dinner time is tough, but the video does provide us that more softer side visual cues that we often don't get, and which we do appreciate when we're in person. But be mindful of the mute button, speak from an I position. Even though we represent communities and towns, this is a meeting that represents that you're going to be speaking, and I'm going to hopefully get some feedback from you from some of the questions. And we realize that this is more of an individual response in some of these cases, so be sensitive to that. We also want to engage with everybody as we get more members participating tonight, but step up to participate, but also realize that if somebody, we want to bring everybody to the table. Don't let the fear of saying something wrong really hold you back from saying something. The topics of equity is one that we're all learning, and how to better engage on the topic itself. So I realize that sometimes we don't know what the correct thing to say, frankly. We're all learning, and be inquisitive, interested, and respectful. So as Dave mentioned, the genesis of the project was part of the transportation bill, the previous session back, where the transportation bill said the Agency of Transportation, in consultation with the RPCs, should conduct and develop a framework, which would be part of the annual transportation process, evaluate how investments can better realize equitable outcomes, and we'll start to develop a definition of what that is. But it will also start to affect the prioritization process. And how can we enhance opportunity for economic opportunities for Vermonters in all communities? particularly those that have been underserved or underinvested in or overburdened in previous years and previous efforts. So as part of this is that this RPC conversation is happening today, and that we'll have a couple other engagement opportunities later in this overall project. Now, I also realize, I believe Otis had sent out this PDF in advance, so I'm not going to kind of read every word on some of these slides, and knowing that you can reference this later on. However, transportation equity, taking a step back, what is it and what are we doing here? Transportation equity is focused primarily about how mobility and transportation can affect and provide us the ways to meet our daily needs. And so the idea is that transportation equity must reduce inequities across the transportation system and the communities that they affect. Transportation equity enables communities and individuals access to safe, affordable, inclusive, and multimodal means to satisfy basic needs. It would achieve resilient and sustainable access to opportunities. I'm emphasizing certain words here because they will be showing up more and more in the materials. We'll aim to reduce transportation-related disparities and adverse community impacts and systemic health inequities. And we realize that this is a process, much like a Vision Zero safety goal or much of our sustainable development goals and climate action goals, is that it's a process to get there. And we realize that transportation equity will be realized when these outcomes are achieved and communities are not overburdened. So these are our working definitions. And at this point, this is something that grounds us in some common vernacular, common language, and that we will revisit these over the next 6 months as this plan reaches fruition. Now, the RPC engagement itself, we have 2 members from RPCs on the working group, which is the team that's advising, and we're meeting a handful of times, 6 or 7 times throughout the project. Within this task 3, which is the element that we're currently in tonight, is that we have other activities where we're going out to the public, stakeholders with kind of one-on-one interviews, as well as more of a deep dive with some particular focus groups with certain communities of interest that I'll describe a little bit further. But we're also having these conversations with RPCs, and namely with TACs. Some of the RPCs have equity groups, some of them have other invited members. And we'll be coming back in task 6 and 7 as we start to develop recommendations and the implementation plan, as well as then sharing the draft and final reports with you. And we'll be circulating those materials, looking for some input. And so meeting tonight is really to initiate you with the process, but also expect that we'll be knocking on your door later on as the report becomes written later on in the fall and late winter, and that we'll be looking for some feedback from you all. And we realize, though, that RPCs are critical partners because you all are the local voice of VTrans in many ways in our local communities, in doing the transportation planning and then developing the priorities, identifying the needs that then works through the typical project development process. Now, we define transportation equity. Now, what is a framework? And the idea is that a framework is starting to identify what questions are we trying to answer so that we can embed transportation equity into it. Who is out in our communities that their needs are currently not being met by the transportation system? What projects or programs might the transportation system need to make it more equitable? How should they be funded? And are there priorities that are starting to become more clear with an equity focus in mind? How are we involving people in the decision-making process? And then particularly for the agency and transportation agencies, public transit agencies, how can these services be delivered in an equitable way? But we realize also that RPCs are conducting services. We realize that there's Title VI legislation and expectations on language and other access barriers, but there might be other ways that we conduct our work that would be more equitable. For example, when meetings are being held and where are they located so that we can reach certain communities. Now, this messy block chart gives us just a sense of kind of the way that things are organizing in terms of the project development process. At the head of it, we have the Agency of Transportation and the RPCs, and that's being led by Michelle Boomhauer at the Agency of Transportation. And Dave Pelletier, who's on the call, project manager, he's leading the effort really on the day-to-day basis with the consulting team. Now that center box is being affected by the various other boxes going into it. We have the working group that I mentioned that's comprised of other state agencies, namely A&R, and we have a DEC rep. Then we have other staff from the Agency of Transportation and the DMV. Then we have the public input, which the RPCs tonight is critically one of those three pillars where we have other stakeholders and direct community engagement. And then the tasks that we're doing, which include some background materials, literature review. We're scanning Vermont and national best practices, and then trying to put it together into a package to identify gaps and opportunities. And so tonight's conversation is starting to ensure that we know what's happening today on the ground in Vermont, but also if there's any interesting ideas, new ways of looking at it, and also just expectations from those that are delivering this at the RPCs. You're going to really influence what recommendations come out of this plan. So backing up even more, beyond Vermont is the federal piece. Vermont's work is not in isolation. The federal government has been quite active in this space since the Biden administration initiated this executive order in January 2021, which it was a first effort to provide a greater sense of characteristics or definitions of what communities we're talking about when we're looking at equity. This goes above and beyond what has been traditional federal Title VI legislation language. And so it provides us a more encompassing and expansive view of our communities and who's out there, and clearly what the federal government is expecting from us in terms of how we engage with different communities around the state. Other federal actions that have subsequently happened after that executive order include the IIJA, which I know we're all aware of from the bipartisan infrastructure law. I haven't done enough scanning of the current Inflation Reduction Act and understand whether that also changes any of the expectations. So the federal government has changing quite a bit on us quite quickly. And I know that's only the equity space, but I know it's affecting a lot of other aspects of our work. But the IIJA provided greater clarity on the populations that we're looking at, the communities. It included expectations on engagement. So it's part of the rules that VTrans and the RPCs have to comply with. It also instituted some ideas of Justice 40, which is saying where should our money be invested in, which communities. Then there were the DOT Equity Action Plan that was released in January 22, and then later the US DOT Strategic Plan. Both of these focused a little bit more narrowly, but they definitely focused on who should be engaged, how much engagement would be now expected as part of the federal funding from the work that we do. And then it also discussed wealth creation, which is an interesting aspect of equity, and how can we make transportation affordable and accessible so that those can save money where possible and to spend that money building wealth. So now carrying out the particular project at hand, the work that the consultant team has had. This slide shows some of the consultants on the project. We're here in task 3, which is the direct engagement, stakeholders, and the RPCs. Currently underway is some work carrying out, looking at gaps and needs, particularly best practices from a national context. And then we have some work underway that's looking at how to improve the data and the tools that VTrans and the Agency of Transportation is using in terms of who's out there in the communities, what does equity mean, where are we investing, and so that we can start to query and track this work over time. The schedule on this slide shows that we're scheduled to be complete sometime around February into March. We think we might push out a little bit more just to benefit from the full amount of information that we're obtaining from the core task 3, which is in the center of this messy kind of Gantt chart. But we're in the core piece of the RPC TAC meetings. You can see we are here at the end of August. And so this is going to continue through September and even into October in terms of meetings with other RPCs around the state. We're working in parallel with some work in task 4 and task 5. And then I'm going to focus in a little bit more about the other activities that are happening in task 6, or excuse me, task 3. We're involving stakeholders and publics in new ways. We're looking at how innovative can we be? What types of engagement is the most effective for different communities? And so this work is innovative because it's primarily a little bit of research as well as collecting primary data. We're trying to understand what tools and methods and best practices could work in the Vermont context, and that will lead us into better understanding how we're going to do this for the future. Because I mentioned how the federal government is changing their expectations of how we do this work. The engagement process will two essential functions. We're trying to understand the barriers and access how people are being involved, but then also identify pathways toward implementation. How can we improve equitable outcomes for our communities? Now, one of the pieces that I've mentioned is about the direct engagement. We're taking a different angle here than what has been maybe typical, and that instead of being a wide solicitation of Vermont communities around the state and saying, let's take a survey, let's try to go to 20 meetings and get a handful of people participating, instead we said, let's go deep and let's go narrow. So we're going to go more focused with these 4 communities: Winooski, Burlington, Northeast Kingdom, even though it's a pretty wide geography, and we have a focus in the Newport area, but also trying to engage with those in mobile homes, particularly with a lower income. Then in Bennington and Rutland. And by focusing in these communities, we are building relationships with community leaders, liaisons, those that have been respected in some of these communities, and then trying a variety of different methods of engagement. So including one-on-one interviews with some particular leaders. We've been knocking on doors. We've been holding traditional kind of community events, pizza parties. There's been some work online, which is a photo voice challenge, such as that somebody would go to a community and, let's say, photograph a transportation challenge that you've had, and then describe that photograph, in a narrative. And that's been a kind of a competition, so to speak. It allows people to then come to a meeting, show off their photos, and it gives them a voice to say, this is my experience. And so, for example, somebody in a wheelchair not having a sidewalk available to them, somebody also having poor bus and transit access. It does vary in the communities. And so we're really curious about the types of results that we're starting to see. The engagement is continuing here throughout the summer and throughout September. And then in October, we're starting to synthesize and understand some of these results. Dave, anything you want to jump in here before I continue to move on?
Okay. Keep on rolling.
Okay. So here we are at the RPC aspect. Today, we're sharing some of the materials. We're trying to get some insights that we've had so far. We're also trying to collaboratively learn and share and better understand what transportation means in terms of the Mount Scottney RPC and how it's embedded in your work to date. And then with the goal of creating awareness of the project, but also understand the linkages between the RPCs and the agency itself, and particularly strengthen your RPC voice in this process. So we realize how essential the RPCs are to the work of transportation planning in the state. And we want to listen tonight as we probe further as to how equity might have been considered and as part of your work. So we're doing this now. We're going to have, this is the conversation part. We're about right on time, where we want to probe with some questions and walk through the preliminary wireframe that we have developed at this point in time. We have these different pillars of equity, and we're going to define each of these for you. And we have some questions attributed to each of these. What I'm going to do is kind of spend time on each of the pillars. And if we're spending too much time on any one pillar, I'll move us along. And depending on how the conversation goes, they're largely interrelated. And so we might be talking about one pillar, even though we're having a question on the other, and that's completely fine. Also, some of these questions are not intended to be any judgment of current behavior. All right, thanks, Dave. The hand sprung the reminder there, but every community is different and every RPC is different. I'm from the southeast part of the state, and I realize that things are different now that I work more or less throughout the state and see these things. And so it's no judgment, but the idea is that I'm going to ask some questions and we may say, I don't really know, John, or then we'll try to dive further and say, all right, can we think about things in a new way? Dave, anything you wanted to add more to that?
No, I just wanted to make sure that that you shared that thought, that this is, we're all learning as we go here, and you can't expect to be, necessarily nailing this, coming from where we've come in history. And so don't, there are no wrong answer. You've heard it before. There are no wrong answers. There's no judgment here. We're just trying to get a sense of what, how equity maybe already has been considered or is being considered in the regions. It's not uncommon for us to have, responses that, oh, we're not really doing anything in this, this area or this realm. And again, in this area, we are kind of working from this angle. So that I just wanted to encourage people to not be shy, and any idea is welcome. And the other thing that I would mention too is that sometimes these conversations have been kind of sparked by the staff level folks who are doing maybe a lot of the technical work and along with and for the advisory for the TAC members and the board members. So that's been a kind of a gateway into broader conversation and spark thought too. So that's good as well.
Great. I did want to offer the opportunity. I covered a lot of ground in terms of some definitions, the process that we've been taking under the project. Are there any questions offhand at this point in time that'd be helpful to answer? Well, don't hold back, as this is meant to be a back and forth here. So there's a lot of text on this first slide, as there are in some of the subsequent ones, but the first pillar is distributive. It's intended to understand who is in our community. It's one of those first questions that was posed by the federal legislation to say, who's out there? How do we know who's in our communities? Who might be missing from our conversations? But the first part is, who do we know lives in our communities? And a lot of I'll give you the first kind of answer here is that most of the data that RPCs use and communities use come from census and the federal government census products, American Community Survey or the US Census itself. Now we realize that has limitations. And so really what I wanted to go further here is that, have there been partnerships with maybe community-based organizations? Have there been invitations to certain communities or certain populations within the Mount region that have been active within the planning of the RPC? So I'll turn it over to anybody in how you want to answer this question. But the point is that, has there been kind of any effort to go beyond the census products?
I'll jump in if no one else wants to. I would say from a data perspective, purely a data perspective, no. I'm happy to be wrong about that. I guess there was the E&D, the Elders and Persons with Disabilities Committee, did do a mail out survey a couple of years ago. So we did get a few responses from that. And that's obviously reaching sort of a community that we would consider to be part of this. But that is all that comes to mind.
Jonathan, that was great. In your organizational chart and in your entire teamwork organization, what is the representation as far as people are that are included in your team from the BIPOC and LGBTQ community?
Well, I don't know the full answer to the second one. I don't know their sexual orientation of any of the staff members in terms of or sexual genders. So I don't know the full answer there. In terms of race, we do have good makeup, I would say, stronger or more diverse than Vermont at large, I would say. So offhand, without a quantification for you, and happy to try to do that if that's an important data point for you. But
not
but
so
yeah,
important,
it's more diverse than
interesting, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yep.
John, I think one thing we recognize as staff in the office is the 2020 census data is suspect. The American Community Survey data has really high margins of error, and we have a lot of smaller communities. So we rely on these data sets, but they're really imperfect. And so, we do need to do more. But to be honest with you, we've had a hard time reaching certain communities in the region. And so, we are all ears if you, as part of this process, find better data sets or better ways to, get input.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I think professionally, we realize that census has some imperfections and limitations, and it's being clear about that versus some people just accept it blanket. This is the truth. So I think it's always wise, and I think a good education for all of us to understand that it has those limitations. I would be interested to see any of the communities, maybe Windsor, I'm thinking of as some areas with some additional diversity or population size anyway. And I don't know other communities that may have joined in there. Have there been any participations at the town level, and frankly, Cavendish and Chester too, but with any local nonprofit or a community assistance organization or some other community organizations to say, are we hearing, particularly maybe aging in place? That's a population that's typically is challenged by the transportation system. Anything like that come to mind from the communities?
We've had a lot of discussions with elderly folks in town. I mean, it's a small town. It's only 3,000 people and stuff. But trying to meet the needs of elderly is extremely important in our town. But when you talk about the makeup of our town, when it comes to the conversations that you have about equity and stuff, it's hard to see how it affects us because we're so, not diverse when it comes to the big scheme of things and stuff. So it seems like when you start a process like this, it almost starts off on the premise that we're doing something wrong to start already, and we're trying to correct it. And I'm just wondering, what have we been doing wrong to have this big change of what's going on here with this document? Because it seems a lot of it, and rightfully so, should be focused on equity and equality in the state and stuff, but what brought all this about?
Yeah, Arnie, it's a great question. I didn't put some of the kind of the facts of other data points in here in the presentation, but Vermont is different. And I think that's what part of this challenge is. And to the federal government, the definition of equity is different. And frankly, rural is challenging. And so the populations that we're talking about, I'll get back to kind of what we're doing and why the genesis of this, but rural itself is a population that has different challenges. And I would posit that that's an equity challenge, is that where has been investments, rural, urban divide. We've also had income. Income is definitely associated with equity, and Vermont has a lot of particularly rural poor. So you have this compounding effect. When you then introduce other characteristics of the population, you typically find other areas of disinvestment and other additional challenges. So you typically, when you compound challenges, particularly, let's say there is a racial low income poverty and in a rural situation, you further have evidence of greater challenges meeting the needs, particularly for health, and meeting the needs of transportation, and how can they access places that they need. Some of the facts that were the genesis of this, there's less of this in Vermont, but there's definitely been historical evidence of purposeful highway building where there were communities that didn't have a voice and they had to be displaced. There are evidence today that there's a strong correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and asthma, and where do people live associated with high volume roads, and income and race. So because the facts that there's numerous correlations between certain communities that have been typically underinvested in or that have not had a voice at the table, so to speak, there's been evidence that those communities are also associated with a number of public health challenges and lack of economic opportunity and economic mobility. So that's where the genesis of this work comes from. And our challenge here is to try to put that in a Vermont context and try to understand what it means in Vermont. What does equity mean in Vermont? How do we address current inequities and try to understand what inequities exist? So that's part of our challenge here. And it's happening all in parallel. I'm asking you for some of these experiences at the same time as trying to say, how can we address it? And then we're doing the same thing in the other tasks. Does that help, Arnie?
Yeah, that helped a lot. It just like broadened the umbrella of the equity instead of just the specifics that you usually hear about lately, where you incorporated a lot more groups in it than just the standard ones that come to mind these days with the income and the location and age and poverty and everything else that comes with it. Yeah, that helped a lot. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Christy, I saw your hand first.
Thank you, John. I was just listening to your last explanation, and I thought it was spot on. And I'm wondering if your thoughts in your departments or the goals of your initiatives are in line with the environmental equity initiative that the legislature passed this past year. And I know the Department of Transportation has a plan to consider the elements that you just spoke on with, for example, highways and roads, et cetera, that they don't have a significant undue impact on low income or racial equity locations. So I think you must be familiar with that environmental equity initiative and what's happening there with the participants on that committee, and how closely are we working with them, or we're aware of that? So are we in parallel or are we in tandem?
Right. I'll answer very quickly and then maybe turn it over to Dave for the latest, but it's going to be a slower moving process than this. As I mentioned, this was initiated 2 cycles ago, and I think the Agency of Transportation therefore is kind of ahead of the overall state at large, and there is absolutely coordination. And so I think the work that will happen here might actually affect how that eventually gets implemented and what types of things they might consider. So because it's at a little bit, because it's more expansive, it's going to be simply moving at a little slower pace than this study. And this study is more geared toward transportation specifically versus all statewide departments at large. Dave, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's right. And Christy, we are coordinating and there's a lot of work to be done, but we very intentionally included some key agency of natural resource staff at leadership levels in this process, seeing that state environmental justice law coming down the pike, so that we would be all rowing in the same direction. And John's hit the nail on the head, where the EJ, the environmental justice law, and all that the state is being tasked to work on it and do is broader and longer term. But we are most certainly coordinating our kind of little bite of the cookie here up front at the transportation agency level to make sure that whatever we do is of service to that greater longer term effort. And there's a little bit of environmental justice, and this is a whole meeting itself, right? In difference between environmental justice and how it relates to equity, and where the overlap is and where equity is a slightly different thing. So suffice to say, the answer is yes, and much more work to be done, but we're closely in communication with our state agency.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. I applaud your efforts on that, and I think the Department of Transportation taking a smaller bite or taking a look at this, and then maybe could use that as a catalyst and for moving forward in other areas. And like you say, it's I'm sure there'll be some amendments, reconsiderations, and additions. And so I applaud you for that.
Great. Diane, let's go, and then and Jason, I saw your hands up. I'll move over to another pillar in a little bit. I'm sensitive that I know you guys got a lot to do, but this is great conversation so far. So Diane?
Okay, I'll try to make this quick. Somebody said Windsor. Well, I'm in Windsor. We do have what we call a JEDI committee. It's Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. This is a small committee that was formed last year underneath the select board. It's mostly focusing on BIPOC problems that have erupted from, lifestyle differences that have changed so dramatically in the last couple of years. I want to say mostly that we're in such a turbulent time right now that even our own municipal offices really don't know who's here. We have homeless people wandering in. You don't even know about them until there's a problem of some kind. They're knocking on your door asking for food handouts, and then we'll go here. It's just we've got climate refugees, of course. You've probably seen that throughout Vermont. New people moving in all the time. Who are they? Well, we're trying to figure that out. But the thing that grabs me, I was so happy to hear you say that, you've gone straight and narrow right down to Rutland, Winooski, Bennington, and the Northeast Kingdom, because that's what you have to do here. You can't go to TAC committees, to find out what people need. You have to go to the supermarket, go to the American Legion, go to a potluck. Well, of course, we're not having potlucks right now. It's really a hard time to be with people, to get in touch with people. It's easier in towns that are already cohesive. Some towns are not. Windsor is not particularly cohesive. We're all independent, all quiet, lots of different clubs, but we're mostly, medium to low income. So we're a good target. That's all I needed to. And I'm glad we're using hands up, because it was very confusing to ask questions unless we're doing the raised hand feature.
Great. Diane, can I ask who's facilitating that JEDI group and who initiated that?
Yeah, it was started by a person, Amanda Smith, who was a member of the select board. She is no longer as of this year, and it's being chaired by a fellow, can't think of it, Evan. He's a social worker who you can probably go onto the Windsor Town website, go look under government, and then under committees, and you'll find it JEDI. And it's Evan is his first name. I can't remember his last name.
Great. Thanks for that. I think it's a helpful example of it's a specific population of interest, but it's an example of that type of other direct community partnerships that are starting to obviously become, I think, valuable in this space. And it's happened throughout the years, we know, but it's nice to have some examples to draw from and provide ideas for other communities. Jason, you want to pop in there?
Yeah, just quickly, we have had to reach out to other means of getting the word out or trying to get input. The Reading West Windsor Aging in Place Committee, for example, maybe more about housing than transportation to date, but Springfield Working Communities Challenge Group has been really helpful. Christine from the Movers in the meeting, we've in the past worked with them and sent surveys and things like that to riders of the public transit system. I think we just have to do a bunch of those sorts of things, and more before COVID, and maybe again, we've been trying to go to where people are, so the farmers markets and those sorts of things. So I think it's a challenge though, but I think we have to do a lot more of that, going to various different committees and other groups to really get this kind of input that we need.
Yeah. Well, if you can I'll send a note afterwards, but I think this goes for everybody, is that if there's examples that you can identify, particularly ones that were most effective, then those are the types of things that I would love to draw out in the report. Kind of I'm envisioning little text boxes to say, hey, this community did this. This is the kind of learning that we've gained from it. And it provides us examples of how to do things in new ways. I think some communities have been thinking about this longer than others, and that's why this is part of the information kind of sharing. But I think you heard, or Jason maybe implied, the financial and time commitments to do these things well is reality. And I think that's also part of this work, is try to understand if the federal government's making these expectations, or we need to do this work to do our work well, where is the support coming from? So I jumped ahead, and as I mentioned, you guys all should have these slides, and I would love to have your own answers to these subsequent to this meeting and any point over the next few months. Frankly, if there's anything that comes to mind, I would love to hear it. One area that typically is identified as something that's common when we're discussing equity: what types of solutions are out there? And that's the needs analysis. How do we identify what types of solutions, what types of investments might be necessary so that we can improve those inequities? And downstream of that then is, how do we build it into our prioritization process? When do those investments come to light? Where are the dollars? How do we make the difficult trade-offs? And so I was going to try to mutually join these two just for the next few minutes and say, have there been examples of any particular investments and projects? And I say projects in a very loose sense. We could talk about planning studies. We could talk about a new route for a transit line. We could be talking about funding help for facilitating the JEDI type of organization. So have there been any examples that that's happened at the regional level or in any communities where specific investments have been made to focus on inequities? Otis, you got the first hand up.
I'll just quickly say, what comes immediately to mind, it's not directly, equity is a consideration of it, although it's maybe secondary or wasn't originally part of this, but Springfield has been doing a good job, and it's a long, hard process to expand their multi-use path, their sort of bicycle network. So obviously that, there are all sorts of considerations there beyond equity, economic development, and that kind of thing, recreation. But, expanding a bicycle network does definitely touch on these issues. And I think they've been putting a lot of effort into both planning and construction to get that moving. So that's what came to mind immediately, at least.
Yeah, and Diane, I'll turn it over to you in a second. I think that's a great example. We've heard numerous times that particularly the bicycle and pedestrian has been identified as there's numerous gaps in that network, and those without cars are a particular population that have lack of mobility options. And so providing multimodal, particularly active modes is a great solution there. So I think there's going to be greater opportunities to flag that's not only just a nice, it's not just an active mode travel anymore, it's actually an equitable mobility option. So the emphasis becomes different, and the way that we justify these investments become different. So that's kind of the learning and I think the evolution of where those projects and who the beneficiaries are of them. Diane, you want to mention something?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to say that this is a real hard economically, financially for Windsor. So we have the same aspirations that we've always had. We want an EV charging station. We know where we would put a bike trail, and I see it's in Jason, Mark's plan, but we don't have the money to do it. So we're sort of mulling over, okay, if we got money, if we got it through ARPA or any of these federal funds, where would we go first? So right now, zilch, really.
Do you think you have projects that fundamentally do address inequities, and it's just simply now the lack of financial ability to deliver?
There may be, but I truly can't think of any right now. There, just the effort that was put into creating that Jedi committee, that was a beginning. But other than that, we have a community garden that was founded last year. Um, but we have our volunteers. It's very difficult to get people to volunteer these days because turmoil, joblessness, etc. So I can't, there may be, and maybe our town manager would be better equipped to answer this, but I can't think of any at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Jason, you wanna take the
Just a
floor?
couple of small examples that I can think of.
Yeah.
Both Bellows Falls and Springfield have a program where they fix up old bikes and get them to folks who might need transportation. So that's a great thing. And then the Springfield Working Communities group was recognized people had a hard time, lower income folks had a hard time finding jobs or whatever. So they were giving laptops away. And then they quickly discovered that they didn't know how to use laptops. So then they had to couple the giveaway with some training and so forth, so folks could apply for jobs and access jobs remotely and that sort of thing. Maybe they don't have cars. And so just a couple of short examples I could think of.
Yeah, and that brings up a point that was observed in other communities, that we don't physically have to go all the places now to accomplish some of our needs, and broadband access, and also just education on how to use the computer resources effectively is part of mobility at a large. Then let's keep going. The prioritization process is one that you guys are all involved in as HAC member, and I think you've gone through one cycle of the VSP2 prioritization process. Is that right? Jason, I'm looking at you, maybe I noticed, but twice. All right, great. Equity is not explicit there, even though there are ways to embed it into the process, particularly regional economic access. Are there any thoughts that you might have? I know this is kind of just springing on you, but in terms of the prioritization and the methods that you have available to you to prioritize projects that could achieve equitable outcomes, do you feel like you have the right tools, or are there other aspects of prioritization that you might need greater data for, or different ways to look at it? Have there been any thoughts on the prioritization front? Yeah. Jason, I'm going to jump to Christy just to change it up. All right, Christy, go for it.
Thanks, John. Coupling with Diane's comments up above, or the previous thought, towns have a significant need for infrastructure needs so that we can better address the equity needs of our communities. And a lot of times it is the funding opportunities, and it is the grant availability, which is provided annually by the state in some cases, and the federal government more recently with their ARPA funding, is trying to get these projects completed. For instance, the sidewalk project on Mineral Street, Springfield, by the state office buildings. We have a sidewalk through 2/3 of it, but not the last third. So it provides safety for people that are visiting, walking to, or bicycling towards the state office buildings for licensing and other probation, parole. There's a bunch of opportunities there within that location. So it is there are projects that we're looking at, I think, as communities that we focus on, but it is funding limited, and it's getting access to the funds when and where we can to accomplish some of these. So when you start prioritizing projects for environmental justice or equity, it may be a little premature, but certainly those efforts are considered, I think, and most communities are considering where the needs are and where they can best serve the community in general. But there's a couple of examples in there, and I don't want to keep rambling on here, so I'll stop there.
No, great. Thank you, Christy. It's great. Jason, you have a couple of thoughts, and then we'll go to Ernie.
Sure. Yeah, I think, an observation that I have, and maybe it's changing, the prioritization process tends to be based on the need and not so much the solution. And, so oftentimes we're looking at, Route 103 in Ludlow really needs to get repaved or whatever. But, we could do better, I think, in recognizing that the community has long wanted a bike path, and it's never going to happen probably because of the crazy costs and the river related constraints. And so, I guess I'd like to see the prioritization process look a little bit more at the solutions and say, yes, it needs paving, but, gee, they really ought to have a buffered bike lane or something like that as part of it, so that we address more than just, the typical paving need. You know what I mean?
Good idea.
Yeah, you think basically there's a more holistic, every project should be kind of vetted with a little bit wider lens, so to speak. And I guess the challenge that I have articulating that in the notes is that does that happen at the point, when does that happen? Does that happen upstream? How do they know that that need exists unless there's been some preparation kind of planning, right? That they can then draw from and say, oh, well, there's a bike path that this community wants here. When the paving project comes in there, they go there and look for it. So it's like always this chicken and egg situation, right? So any thoughts that you do share afterwards, I would love to kind of say, ferret that one out a little bit more. Arnie.
Well, I'd just like to echo what Christy was saying, that in the work that we do in town government and the prioritization projects and stuff, equity's always been a concern there, because it's always, the project is addressing a certain area of town or a certain group of people, or whether it's bike paths or whether it's roads. And those are always considerations that we take into account when we're deciding what's good for the community. So I see that we're looking at it through different eyes, but it's kind of been there all along also. It's not like it's just something new that's just come up either. I just feel that the people in our town have always been concerned about each other and about the different groups that are in town and about the people in the village and how we can make things better for everybody. I just want to throw that out there.
So true.
Yeah, appreciate that, Ernie. All right. Well, I'm going to be moving us along kind of to these general questions that are on the back end of the presentation that you should have available to you. That if there's anything that kind of grabs you here, we can sit here and chat about it. But I'm also mindful about kind of where you're going for the rest of your meeting. But the idea is that definitions of equity. So Arnie, we discussed a little bit about the wide expanse of what this means, particularly in a Vermont context, and setting that I think is really valuable and important. So how does the RPC itself view equity? And do we need to hear from you in a way that might influence kind of how the state takes this on? And how do we realize that maybe it's not, we need a definition that's flexible for a lot of the different parts of the state as well. We also want to make sure that the framework is valuable to you and how can it be best used. And then I think it's really what would be a successful framework for you. So if there's any thoughts that you might have that you're able to share now, I would love to have that. Otherwise, then we can kind of turn it over to Jason and Otis and Dave and see if there's any other thoughts kind of from the staffing level. So anybody from the TAC have any thoughts on these? Diane, go for it.
I think what jumps out at me is that climate is a big player here, and things are going to get worse each year, as you know, we know all about this stuff. Equity is going to be, as you mentioned before, it's these people who are from, who the underserved who are going to be hurt the most. So by helping the climate, going toward doing what we have to do to mitigate carbon, we're also helping the underserved. So it seems like this has to be work hand in hand. And so to go back to this bike path, and okay, maybe we do need to pave that road, but gee, it needs to be paved every other year, and we keep driving on it, and we're never going to stop driving. Well, let's stop driving on it. We can't do that right now. Well, we will have to do that pretty soon. So let's get started. So everything that Jason said about broadening that perspective and not just doing the same as usual, just really working with the climate committee in Montpelier to do what we have to do to switch over and make the transition. That will work hand in hand with empowering the underserved.
Thanks, Diane. Okay. Well, Jason and Otis, is there anything that's jumping out at you that you want to kind of conclude with based on our conversation today? Or make sure we leave with?
Well, this, it's new and it's not new, but certainly we're just now, we have a draft regional plan right now, and we are just now, unfortunately, thought to include equity. And so I think we've been prompted by the various levels of government talking about this currently to do that. I don't know that we really define it, but certainly as a rural area, we tend to be more about sex, gender, low income. There are other folks out there, but that tends to be our focus. And so I guess I don't know if the Northeast Kingdom community is from a rural place, but I think my plug would be to just make sure that we're looking at rural ways of thinking about equity as part of this.
Otis, did you want to supplement anything?
Yeah, I guess all I wanted to add is what I'm really curious to hear about what comes from this is sort of any recommendations or how to reach people who we so far have not been good at reaching when we do things like select projects and design projects and things like that. We tend to talk to the same people a lot, and maybe we have some ideas of how we could reach people better, but I'm really curious to see what kinds of recommendations come out of this, and not just sort of a one-off, for this project, we're going to get this committee together, but sort of an ongoing conversation, and how do we start that and keep it going is something I'm really hoping to get a sense for. Just a small ask, nothing big, but yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing sort of what this recommends in that kind of direction.
It's very helpful. It definitely resonates with other comments that we've heard, and I think a desire. And I think we can provide you examples and ideas, but implementing them, that's always the challenging part, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Dave, do you want to say anything last? I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can go from there.
I just want to thank everybody for really putting your minds to the subject and having this discussion with us tonight. We have much work to do, and I'm hopeful that this framework, this report can serve as sort of a basis for for a lot of our kind of initial understanding of what we're talking about here, ideas about how we might operationalize, and develop strategies that we can use to address some of these issues that we've talked about. So, and I do want to acknowledge too, as John mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the RPCs are a huge part of what we do at the agency in terms of being our arms and our feelers out into the communities and our presence in a lot of ways. And so we have a lot of respect for the work that you do and appreciate it. And I just want to, emphasize the importance that we see in our relationship with you in this work, and our desire to kind of, go at it as partners moving forward through the TPI program and project development and the other ways that we deliver transportation services and projects. So thanks very much.
See, Christie had his hands up. Virtual hand. Oh, gotta get him, come off mute. Luckily, it's the first time tonight.
All right. Thanks. Is that better? I would be remiss. I neglected early on in the meeting this evening to have everyone else introduce themselves, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least recognize Christine Howe as director of the Movers Transportation Initiatives and what they're doing for our community. That falls in line with exactly of what some of these accomplishments are going to achieve. She's serving the working class with the transportation from community to community, as well as the elderly population that we have in town in Springfield, which is significant, as well as the perhaps the underserved community. So I just want to give her a nod for participating this evening and for what she does. Didn't know if she wanted to have a comment.
Yeah, by all means.
Actually, I'm kind of taking everything in tonight. This is only my second meeting with this committee, and there's a lot of information that's coming out tonight. And yes, there's a lot of times I was going to jump in when we were just talking about all that stuff, but I kind of feel it's probably better for me to answer in email so I can really come up with the right answers. But yes, we do serve a tremendous amount of population in Springfield, Chester, Windsor, and we're always looking to expand that. And as I'm sure Dave and everybody knows, up in V-Trans, it's all about money and resources, usually drivers, vehicles, etc. And we say it every day, if we could give every single person a ride that wants a ride, that would be awesome. So that is our goal. It's just a matter of figuring out how to do it. So thank you. And yes, I'm taking it all in, and I will definitely send comments via email.
Wonderful. Well, I really do appreciate everyone's time tonight. I know you got a long night. I really like the example of the Jedi and then other communities. I hear again and again that there are project list miles long. Money comes down to a fundamental aspect of it. I think then probably some of the learning that I'm glad to share is that if we reframe things, look at who's using it, put an equity lens on things, we might see things in a new way. We might be able to emphasize certain projects differently. Might also attract more federal funding with different emphasis areas. So we can look at things in slightly new ways. I think hearing about the communities, we are diverse. It's age, it's income, it's race, it's ethnicity, it's all kinds of characteristics. The definition of equitable communities doesn't end. It simply says who is not meeting their daily needs, and we need to try to figure out who that is and how can we best meet those needs, meet those challenges. And so we'll look to try to provide those examples of engagement. We'll be sharing what we hear. We'll be summarizing kind of all the RPC's conversations. We'll be putting that together into a kind of a written narrative that then we'll be sharing, and be excited for your feedback once we publish that. So thank you again. And you should have my contact information on the last slide of the PDF that was attached to the meeting invite. Feel free to email me with any further thoughts, comments. You have Dave's contact information there as well. There is a link to the website that will be perpetually updated with some events and narrative as we continue to develop this project over the next few months. So thank you again for your involvement tonight. Appreciate it.
Very good. Good discussion, people. Thank you so much for all the questions and input and comments. Next item on the agenda is the Regional Transportation Plan Public Hearing Draft